What is the scariest short story you've ever read? I heard one. A father is laying in bed after just waking up. He grabs the baby monitor and walks to his desk in his office at home. He has his baby on the baby monitor and hears his wife singing to her. He cracks a smile as he hears his wife, "Go to sleep, go to sleep," when suddenly the front door opens up and his wife comes in with groceries. Here's one that scared me so much when I was younger. A young boy is sleeping in his bed on a usual night. He hears footsteps outside his door and peeks out of his eyes to see what is happening. His door swings open quietly to reveal a murderer carrying the corpse of his parents. After silently propping them up on a chair, he writes something on the wall in the blood of the dead bodies. He then hides under the child's bed. The child is scared beyond belief. He can't read the writing on the wall and he knows the man is under his bed. Like any child, he pretends that he slept through the whole thing and hasn't awoken yet. He lays still as the bodies, quietly hearing the breaths from under his bed. An hour passes and his eyes are adjusting more and more to the darkness. He tries to make out the words, but it's a struggle. He gasps when he finally makes out the sentence, "I know you're awake." He feels something shift underneath his bed. I heard a good one a while back. Mommy told me never to go in the basement, but I wanted to see what was making that noise. It kind of sounded like a puppy and I wanted to see the puppy, so I opened the basement door and tiptoed down a bit. I didn't see a puppy and then Mommy yanked me out of the basement and yelled at me. Mommy had never yelled at me before and it made me sad and I cried. Then Mommy told me never to go into the basement again and she gave me a cookie. That made me feel better, so I didn't ask her why the boy in the basement was making noises like a puppy, or why he had no hands or feet. A young boy is sitting in school, not really paying attention. Absent-mindedly, he looks out the window and notices a picture laying on the ground outside the school. After school ends, he goes and picks up the picture and realizes it is a picture of a young girl holding up the two-fingered peace sign. She is the most beautiful girl he has ever seen, and he spends the entire evening asking around town if anybody knows her or where he can find her. No one knows, and he returns home disappointed. That night, he is suddenly awoken in bed and sees the girl from the picture standing on the other side of the street from his window. He quickly rushes to see the girl, but is struck by a car while crossing the street and is killed. The police investigators found a picture lying next to his body of a young girl holding up 3 fingers. There was a hunter in the woods who, after a long day hunting, was in the middle of an immense forest. It was getting dark, and having lost his bearings, he decided to head in one direction until he was clear of the increasingly oppressive foliage. After what seemed like hours, he came across a cabin in a small clearing. Realizing how dark it had grown, he decided to see if he could stay there for the night. He approached and found the door ajar. Nobody was inside. The hunter flopped down on the single bed, deciding to explain himself to the owner in the morning. As he looked around, he was surprised to see the walls adorned by many portraits, all painted in incredible detail. Without exception, they appeared to be staring down at him, their features twisted into looks of hatred. Staring back, he grew increasingly uncomfortable. Making a concerted effort to ignore the many hateful faces, he turned to face the wall, and exhausted, he fell into a restless sleep. Face down in an unfamiliar bed, he turned, blinking in unexpected sunlight. Looking up, he discovered that the cabin had no portraits, only windows. A man goes to an old hotel. He gets his key from the reception and heads off to his room. As he walks down a hall to his room, he hears crying coming from behind one of the doors in the corridor. He stops at the door the crying is coming from and looks through the keyhole. A woman in black with wrinkled hands, covered in liver spots and her face covered by a veil, is sitting on a stool in the corner of the room sobbing. The man asks if she needs help. She doesn't answer. He asks again and the reply continues to be nothing but crying. The man decides that he's too tired to help and continues to his room. The next morning, as he is walking down the same hall to go to reception, he remembers the old woman. He goes to her door and hears silence. He peeks through the keyhole and sees nothing but red. The man gives up and goes to the reception to check out. As he is leaving, he mentions the crying woman in the room to the receptionist. The receptionist turned pale and says that room is said to be haunted by an old woman. The man laughs it off and heads to the door. He is stopped in his tracks when the receptionist says the ghost is an old woman with red eyes. So this girl is sitting in her room, and her friend calls and tells her to stay inside because there's a killer on the loose in the neighborhood, and the cops want everyone to stay safe and out of the way. The girl, fearing for her life, grabs her dog and gets him to lie down under her bed as a sort of safety measure. She hears the police sirens and commotion outside her house, but is consistently reassured by her dog licking her hand every so often. Just then, a bang erupts from downstairs, and the dog scampers out of her room. There's a loud ruckus, but eventually the door opens and the dog gets under her bed again. Everything is normal as it comes. Then she hears the police enter through her front door. "Ma'am, come down here, please." So she goes down to talk to them, only to discover a pile of bloody matted fur in the corner of her living room. "What? No, it can't be, I swear. My puppy was upstairs just a second ago, licking my hand." The cop unholsters his weapon and begins walking up the stairs, calling to her behind him. Humans can lick too. You hear a call from downstairs. It's your mother. "Come downstairs, sweetie, I need to speak to you." You proceed to walk down the stairs when you hear another call from your parents' bedroom. The voice is your mother's. She says, "Don't go down, I heard it too." What do? "Hello, my dear. You do not know who I am, but I know you. I am one of the 3 demons that were assigned to you at birth. You see, some people in this world are destined for greatness, destined to live happy, fulfilling lives. You, I am afraid, are not one of those people, and it is our job to make sure of that." "Who are we?" "Oh yes, of course, how rude of me. Allow me to introduce us. Shame is my younger brother, the demon on your left shoulder. Shame tells you that you're a freak, that those thoughts you have are not normal, that you will never fit in. Shame whispered into your ear when your mother found you playing with yourself as a child. Shame is the one who makes you hate yourself. Fear sits on your right shoulder. He is my older brother, as old as life itself. Fear fills every dark corners with monsters, turns every stranger on a dark street into a murderer. Fear stops you from telling your crush how you feel. He tells you it is better not to try than let people see you fail. Fear makes you build your own prison. Who am I, then? I am the worst of your demons, but you see me as a friend. You turn to me when you have nothing else, because I live in your heart. I am the one who forces you to endure, the one who prolongs your torment. Sincerely, Hope." Last year, on the SA forums, there was a story about how a guy was driving through the mountains and came across a crash. The car wasn't damaged at all, and almost deliberately placed in the middle of the road. He drove past and saw 2 people lying in the road. He pulls up in front of the crash and then looks back to see the people sat up, and 20 or so eyes reflecting in his taillights from the surrounding bushes. He slams on the gas and goes. This story scares me because this kind of thing does happen with mountain tribes who are either cannibalistic or crazy. Gateway of the Mind. In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without access to any senses or ways to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed that the 5 senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world, he was alone with his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but were not convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for 3 days until he started having severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point, he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientists rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to a table so he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head and, despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with the scientist for the first time in the study. He whispered, "I have spoken with God, and He has abandoned us," and his vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death. A girl hiked the Appalachian Trail by herself and brought along a few disposable cameras. 3 months later, when she was finished, she got the cameras developed. Once every 5 or so photos from all over her trip was a picture of her sleeping. Story always terrifies me when I am camping. Found one a while ago. A woman lived alone with her dog, a large Doberman. One day, she came home and her dog was choking on something. She attempted to dislodge the object in his throat, but she couldn't. She rushed the dog to the vet, who said he would work on the dog and call her later. 2 hours later, the woman gets a call from the vet. "Get out of the house. The police are on the way. They will explain," he says in a hurried voice. Afraid, she runs out of the house. When the police arrived, they charge into the house and run upstairs. She asks one of the men what is happening. "The vet found what your dog was choking on. It was 3 human fingers." A few minutes later, the police escort a man out of her house. He was clutching his right hand because he was missing 3 fingers. There's this guy who moves back in with his parents for a few months to save up money. He has to sleep in a bedroom that is down in the basement. He feels this weird presence of some entity that keeps trying to get into his room. All night, every night, he senses this presence pacing the wall outside his room, like it's itching to get at him. As the days go by, the entity gets braver and starts coming into his room at night, getting closer. He finally catches glimpses of it and describes it as a black human-type figure squatting, walks on all 4s, and it just paces, staring at him. Finally, one night, he decides it's time to man up and really see what this thing is. So he waits for it in his bed. He can feel it pacing, getting very close, staring at him. He opens his eyes, and squatting there before him is his mother, staring. The next morning, she acts totally normal, somewhat supernatural. A man wakes to find himself in an office building. He sees people walking outside but cannot attract their attention. His phone rings from time to time. If he does not answer it, golem-esque creatures enter the room and beat him. If he does answer, it's a garble of insect noises and shrieking on the line. He tries to escape, only to find that all doors lead to halls with locked doors or other halls. He is given food in the form of stale donuts and cold coffee. Fearing suicide, he finally sees a woman with blonde hair who wants to escape. The golems come, but she runs while he is beaten. The next day, he receives his daily allotment of old donuts and coffee. The donuts have blonde hair in them. A little boy always told his mom he had a friend he would play with when he was lonely. One day, the parents of the young boy went to dinner and a babysitter came for the night. The babysitter could not find the boy anywhere in the house. She went to look in the attic and the boy was playing with a midget who had been living in the attic for years. I avoid attics at almost all costs now.